Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a crack unit of sleeper agents leveraging lucid dreaming to sleep within dreams within dreams. This episode, I talked to James De Llis of, among other things, Hermitix podcast fame about his newly published short story collection, There's a Man Crying in the Street and Other Stories. 2 5-star reviews of this work on Amazon read, "Glad I'm not British," and "Yum yum in my tum tum." Having read and thoroughly enjoyed this book, I can agree with these sentiments. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon and have weekly chats with subscribers about our most recent episode. I've also published a novel called Tower, if you're interested in hearing more from me. And finally, we have a Discord server for this podcast, on which you can find Levi, me, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell, the link to which is, once again, in the show notes. So, this was my first time interviewing someone. I had a great time, I hope James had a great time, and I hope you have a great time listening, as I seek to deliver value in everything I do. Enjoy. So the focus of this podcast began as Levi and I reading books that we knew we'd hate and which people were interested in and wanted to hear about but weren't willing to read. Obviously, the focus of the podcast has changed now that we're reading things we want to read. As such, this is more of a book club from heaven rather than a book club from hell episode, given that I really enjoyed your short story collection, There's a Man Crying in the Street and Other Stories. Mm-hmm. So to start this off, can you just say well, I've already said the name of your book, but if you'd like to repeat it, say the name of your book, what it's about, where people can find it.
Mm-hmm. I will just say you might have to, there's a tiny bit of lag and delay, just so you know. But I think the audio, your audio is coming through fine. So if I pause, that'd be why. My latest book is called There's a Man Crying in the Street and Other Stories. It is a collection of, possibly you could call them horror stories, but I would say they're more weird fiction, uncanny stories. And it can be found on Amazon. As of the moment, that's the only place you can find it. That's the book.
And so, how did this project start? Did it start as a short story collection or a longer work? Did it start with the intention of being a collection of weird or horror adjacent stories, or did it evolve that way as you were writing them?
So I know you wanted to talk about the process of writing, so a lot of this will be about the process of writing. And I like to think I'm fairly transparent about how banal my writing process is. So with respect to the stories, what happened was, I had a document page in my Notion, which I use for admin, which I just titled something, and then I had a numbered list, and every now and again where I had an idea for a story, I would just write down the sentence, and then in brackets give a tiny amount of detail so I remembered what the hell I meant from it. Like, to give an example, and this is really how banal my writing process is, to be honest. To give an example, one idea I had was that someone would find a small little box in a random shed somewhere, and it would kind of immediately just send them into hell, and for no real reason. And I think I titled that at the time, Man Finds Box, starts and it's just eternally screaming. And I put in brackets what I meant, and I just left that. And then I did that about 20 or 30 times with different ideas, and a lot got cut from the book because some didn't work. And one thing you find with when I went back to flesh these stories out, some that I thought would be really long were 4 pages, and some that I thought would be a page were, much longer. So that's pretty much my process, is just get the idea down and then it figures itself out. And I tend to write unless they were really quite long, which there isn't too many that are that long in the book. They were less than, say, 8 pages. I tended to write them in the first go in one sitting, because There's a certain atmosphere, and once you're in it, it's just get it out, get it done. And then editing is really where the actual process of, I mean, a lot of people say this is nothing new, but editing is really where the real writing sort of begins. Yeah, that was where it came from. I never really planned to write a short story collection, and I do quite enjoy the short story genre now. Actually, I think a lot of those sort of philosophical ideas work better in that form. So I have already started like doing the same thing again of putting ideas down for stories for another possible volume. Yeah. As for the ideas themselves, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, that's the probably the more mysterious aspect of writing or of generating thoughts in general, where the thoughts come from.
Mm-hmm.
It was nice to read this because it also rekindled my interest in the short story genre. I started reading Cosmocomics by Italo Calvino and the Atrocity Exhibition by Ballard, which is not quite a short story collection in the same way that your collection is, but it's more, I guess it's more of a fractured series of novels, so it's more short story adjacent. It is a nice aspect of the short story that it allows you a degree of experimentation which is harder with a longer work, in that you have a brief story, and each time you start a new story, to a large extent you can reset the characters, where they're situated, their inner lives. And you did this it really seemed to be orbiting around a few themes. It's interesting that you brought up weird fiction, because I was thinking this feels somewhat like horror, but it's not quite horror, in that there's the feeling of a mundane everyday life covering over something awful. Whereas quite often in weird fiction, the thing being covered over is this primordial chaos, something completely incomprehensible. Whereas in many of your stories, it seemed to be nothing, or as close to nothing as you can get, just this terrible, hysterical simplicity. And at least to my mind, many of these stories were almost clinical case studies in how different people are going to respond to that nothing. Some of these people respond, it's unusual, but every now and then it almost seems quite positive, in that I think it's the place that's green like sea foam. It almost rekindles a marriage. In Wet Sock, which is one of my favourites, it's a deeply unsettling image. I don't want to give too much of the story away, of the specific plot details, because there's a real delight in reaching the end of it. But, for example, the subject in that story embraces nothing, or is fascinated enough by nothing to really try to become one with it. Did you find yourself consciously trying to experiment with different responses to nothing in this way, or was it really you thinking about a particular unusual situation and just following that through, and this apparent structure emerged organically from that?
Well, firstly, I mean, I wish you were around when I was trying to write the blurb, because it probably would have been better than the one that I've got right now, because I didn't like writing the blurb. I think you've hooked on to something, though, of whether or not it's organic or an artificial process, and I think it has to start with something artificial. And I think there's this, I guess, in the sense that there's apparently a relationship between comedy and tragedy. I think there's probably a relationship between comedy and horror, which is in some aspect related to tragedy. And one of the rules of comedy, in a way, is, I think there's some rules, I don't know, they're not iron laws, but one is to be specific, and one is to sort of, you take something and turn it up to like 11, right? You dramatize it to the point of absurdity, in a way. And a lot, I found, I think, when I was writing these single sentences on the ideas of a book, a lot of them were, what is the limitation? What is basically the limitation this human being has got themselves, or has just found themselves within, that they then have to deal with? And then from that, I think once you have a limitation, I think creativity comes from limitation, not from openness at all. There has to be a pressure. And I think that was the thing, was if you give yourself a limitation, there is there's a pressure. Something has to be forced out some way, like a hydraulic press video, right? Is like a horror of this has to go somewhere, right? And there's like an intriguing abstraction in that acknowledgement of, I'm sure most people know what I mean when I speak of a hydraulic press video, of this notion of something. There can't be a pleasant resolution to this in a way. This idea of it has to go somewhere. But then from that limitation, like with Wet Sock, I found a lot of the time that the organic way it went was actually a lot of the characters, not all of them, to be fair. I mean, someone else has said that ultimately it's a book of people either dealing or not dealing with a problem. And a lot of the characters, I was probably nicer to them than I expected. But it's not nice in a way that a lot of people other people witnessing it would think it's nice. I mean, Wet Sock is the key example that, as you described it, not to spoil the specifics of it, but in the embracement of the void in a playful sense, comes a resolution which is, well, it's not exactly negative, I don't think. Yeah, but this notion of nothingness actually was you're in luck, because it's a conversation I had just yesterday with Brad Baumgartner, the writer of Weird Mysticism, who was dealing specifically with the concept of nothingness with writers like Ligotti, Bataille, Chiron, who were all direct influences actually to my book. One of the bigger influences at the time actually being Blanchot, who is someone who is explicitly dealing once again with nothingness. And ultimately, the paradox of nothingness is, if I'm saying nothingness, nothing isn't nothing, right? Nothing isn't nothing because the fact that you can acknowledge the am I back?
Yep, you're back.
Cool. So the fact that you can acknowledge the paradox of nothingness as a nothing is a problem in a way of, to get abstract, it's a problem of apathetic theology, of apathetic theology being the negation of being. So you know, in the medieval sense, to get to God, well, God is unknown. So anything that is known, which is reasoned by the human mind or sensed by our faculties, is known. So that can't be God. And you keep that process of negation going on till, well, what might it be that God is? And it seems that process of apathetic theology is ultimately taking you two possible directions, either taking you to God, or it's either taking you to a void, which becomes a sort of nihilistic God, or if you, I don't know, or just it becomes nothing. And I mean, there's one story in there which is related to someone who may or may not have had the experience that goes towards God in some sense, but that's sort of doubtful, I think, or at least dubious. And there is the other stories, I think, are people ultimately coming to grips with the fact that there's a nothingness out there that is something they still have to deal with, even if it's nothingness. Many are disappointed. Many are somewhat happy about it. I think mostly it's a disappointment, to be honest, is the main thing. Yeah. I hope I didn't lag out or anything too much there. I'm having a few connection issues.
Yeah, you lagged out a tiny bit, but
okay,
it's still holding.
Okay.
It was very interesting what you were saying before about this connection between comedy and both horror and weird tales, because there were some of these stories that I wanted to ask if you intentionally wrote them to be funny, because I found them very, very funny. For example, the armored man, when we're talking about mundanity pushed to a limit, it's a man who has his car scratched, and from there, his initial response is one that I think almost everyone who's had some sort of property or something that they care about damaged can relate to. And then that feeling is pushed to a comic extreme with a punchline on behalf of his family that I thought was a really fantastic end to it, but reinforces the absurdity of it, and also how different people respond to this nothingness. Similarly, Sleeping Thomas, I thought was very, very funny. It's also interesting you bringing up Bataille as an influence. I was wondering if, for example, in something like Sleeping Thomas, Bataille was an influence. This feeling of having life and consciously wasting it, consciously trying to waste as much of it as possible without dying to sustain that waste. Was that a conscious influence on that particular story, or is this a pareidolia of literary influences on my behalf?
It's an intriguing way to look at it. I mean, I hadn't really seen I found when I was writing Sleeping Thomas, Sleeping Thomas in short, it's probably one of the shortest stories in there actually, and it was going to be much, much longer. There's going to be loads and loads of details of it. So Sleeping Thomas is a story quite simply about a man who is min-maxing or, arranging and organizing his entire life past. Let me restart that thing. Sleeping Thomas is about a man who, at a certain point of his life, realizes that life isn't worth living, but doesn't want to kill himself because he feels that there's sort of a sacredness to death that is death's alone, right? And he can't really take that from death, but he doesn't want to live. So from that point on, he arranges and organizes his life to not exist as much as possible, which is to sleep. So he's sleeping like just basically constantly, and changing everything so he can. In terms of like a limit experience or some way of abusing the wastage of life, that's an intriguing read. I mean, I think I wrote it more in the sense that he just really is that sick and bored of life that he just wants out. And I mean, even to the point of getting annoyed when he actually has dreams, because they take the bliss of complete non-existence away from him. But I mean, there's a certain acknowledgement of expenditure there of the willful. I mean, but I think I see the willful acknowledgement of wasting life in the world already. That I think a lot of humanity who can't push past that Landian moment are actually in the death throes of just filling time, as people aptly talk about it. So I think maybe Sleeping Thomas is just putting to the fore what most people are doing anyway, and what most people really is all they can do. Yeah, I like Sleeping Thomas. I like Thomas as a character, though. I would have liked to have met him and had a chat with him, but I don't think he'd have enjoyed that.
I'm glad you cut it down, because part of the potency of it is how short and straight to the point it is. This is a man who gets a particular haircut because an errant hair wakes him up when he's trying to sleep. It's a very parsimonious and effective characterization. Much of the humor and much of the horror of these stories is really more or less the same thing as in Sleeping Thomas, just trying to sleep through all of life. Or the checkout woman is dead. This fundamentally ridiculous situation, but also a situation which is it's not pushed too much further than everyday reality. It's still definitely within sight of a mundane life. The cruise, for example, as well, which is, I felt was almost Balladian in how it, in very glassy, almost clinical prose, describes what's almost an everyday experience of going on a cruise ship, just in a very, very disturbing break from reality. In this case, just
nothing to do,
having enough people on board.
Yeah, there's nothing there.
There's this one variable that's changed, which makes everything else feel so unsettling.
Yeah, I think you've hooked on something there. I mean, in terms of the comedy, there's something there. I mean, once again, that sort of rule of comedy of turning one thing up, or maybe removing one thing and saying, well, how would you deal with reality now? I mean, that's possibly a facet of modernity we ignore, is without a certain single thing, situations become actually kind of really odd. And there's a distinct Britishness to the book, but it might carry across to other Western countries, I think. But like, I mean, one everyday example of this is sort of unspoken rules, which when broken change situations to become not necessarily horrifying, but very weird. So like people who suddenly speak at a normal level of speaking within like a doctor's office, for instance, is a sort of weird experience because it breaks an unspoken rule. But the humor there, I mean, what's interesting is the other people who've either reviewed the book or spoke to me about it, all the responses have differed in the reader's own appreciation of the story. So some of the people haven't found it that funny. They've enjoyed it, but they haven't found it that funny at all. Or some have found it, as you say, humorous. But I definitely wanted to move away from being scared or whatever that might be. So this is why, I mean, I'm not going to say it's not labelable. I would just say it's weird fiction and uncanny fiction. But and there's horror elements. But I mean, if it's Kafkaesque, there you go. I'll say the word.
I agree with you that it's definitely horrifying, but it's not straight ahead horror as in being chased by something very large that wants to eat you. It's a much more pervasive sense of vulnerability, and the humor really heightens that because horror or weird fiction can very rapidly become one note and quite ineffective if the reader is just constantly being assaulted by something horrifying, something unsettling. But if you're able to lighten it with even a little bit of humour, it lays everything bare in a much more effective relief rather than someone, I suppose, trying to consciously write horror fiction and to horrify the reader.
So something you said there, I mean, it gives me an idea for a story, to be honest. So you said, in terms of traditional horror, something very larger that wants to eat you. And that makes me imagine, like the typical horror scene, the stereotypical horror is contained within the moment of, I'm really scared that there's a huge thing that wants to eat me, and it probably would result in like a chase scene. And then eventually we maybe catch a small glimpse of the thing that launches on someone. And what I'm interested in those moments is, to be honest, because I find those moments pretty cheap. And I think we've gone beyond that as a species existentially. So what would interest me in something very large that wants to eat you would actually be someone running for so long that they eventually actually question it and stop and turn and have a conversation with the thing, right? Oddly, it springs to mind, maybe this is where I got some influence. I mean, they're really crap movies. The first one was reviewed quite well, but the scary movies, the scary movie, the satire films, I think the first one was reviewed fairly well and 2 was whatever. But I remember actually there's a scene in one of them where they're running from skeletons and one of the characters says, wait a minute, what the fuck am I doing? And then just breaks the skeleton to bits, right? And I feel that same way about a lot of horror. I feel that way about Stephen King's It. And he kind of acknowledges that at the moment, at the end, when they have this weird psychoanalytical, we acknowledge our fear. But I always think the end of that book would have been more interesting if they stopped and actually had a conversation with the clown and just sort of said, "Hey, what? You're a clown? You're a clown. Come on." So yeah, I mean that's the subversion I'm interested in, and then forcing people into that discussion. I mean, what's more terrifying, being in a room with a werewolf that stereotypically does want to eat you, or being in a room with a werewolf that for some reason isn't eating you and I don't know, is just sat looking at you, that's and then push someone into that room. I know what would scare me more. So yeah, I guess maybe you could call it postmodern, but I think in the realms of the modern world, we have these moments every day with unquestioned rules and uncanny feelings about things. And with the checkout, the checkout woman is dead. I'm sure people can assume from the title what that's about. It's just a man who sees that a checkout woman is dead and everyone is going about their day. I mean, that's probably not. I didn't explicitly do it, But there are multiple stories of, especially in places like China, where workers have died at their desk and no one realized for like 2 days, just because that's how the culture is. And that's probably a reality at some point in the UK as well. But also there's the element, no offense to retail workers, because I've been there myself, of a certain complete deadening of the self to be able to get through. It's almost on par with Sleeping Thomas, that these people are basically dead for 8 hours just to get through the absolute banality or banal nature of retail work. So, one could say, hang on, is this whole thing a symbol of quite literally how unalive this woman is? But I would, people can read it how they like, death of the author, whatever. But I would say, I would emphasize that I'm not big on the symbol thing. I usually like to think of these things as literal. So yeah.
That probably goes some of the way towards my feeling, which I expressed earlier, of how these really seem to be brief, almost clinical case studies where you take a character, you take everyday experience, and you'll modify one or two variables, either remove them or push them to an absurd limit, and then you see what happens. You've got your hypothesis, your conditions, and then very quickly you record your results, and then the story ends. So, well, okay, I've seen where this goes. I've described it to you. Now I'll move on to another story. Going back to the image you were saying earlier about you being stuck in a room with a werewolf and you seeking to subvert that. My feeling with these stories or these case studies was even more abstract than you're not trying to have someone scared because they're in a room with a werewolf. Not even you're trying to scare them by the werewolf doing something unusual that you don't expect. My feeling was more that there was something, if not malevolent, then completely inhuman or uncaring about humans, about the room itself. It's the subversion of those horror tropes is that the room is this uncaring background which is in some way pushing back against those within it. That was where I felt a lot of the most unsettling sensations in these stories came from. For example, in something like The Lane, it's the environment itself is, if not pushing back on the characters, then it's demonstrating how completely unconcerned it is about them.
Yeah, so with The Lane, and I think, honestly, I will have to write a novella, but I'm not skilled enough at the moment to be able to articulate the atmosphere of it. The Lane comes from a very... whereabouts are you from?
From Australia, from Melbourne.
Australia, okay. So I don't know if this will carry across because I don't know. I think I think everywhere has a distinct suburban culture. And
also, I did live in London for a while. So
okay.
Some of these stories were giving me flashbacks to the grimmer aspects of.
So I don't. Maybe about it might work for London, but there's The Lane was the one story that was drawing on this, but I would want to put this into a whole novella. There's so many young people in the UK who, if you're not in somewhere like London or a big city where there is a bit more to do, but you're in like a middling town, so not in like a village that's so small you're like, well, I have to sit at home. But these middling towns, which is when a lot of people in the UK grow up, and a lot when you're young, it's right. When you're young, what you do is walk around housing estates, what Americans would call suburbs, and there's a extremely liminal, potent nothingness of these housing estates, of turning a corner and of seeing something that's kind of different but not, and just walking around all day with really nothing to do because you're young and haven't got much money or whatever, and there's no facilities or whatever in the town. And then occasionally you'll stop and sit on a wall and drink some lemonade or something, right? And that's sort of your whole day, is just doing that and going to random places that really have long since been defunded and are decaying and just existing in that space. And so The Lane was really about that notion of like, just that atmosphere. I think is interesting for I think for personal development as well. I mean, what effect does that have on people? I think maybe American suburbs have a different feeling from that, because the British one, it's usually always overcast and drizzly and just really grey. But The Lane is the clearest story where there is the unacknowledgement of just a nothing. And when I originally sent that story to someone actually early on, who was a publisher, they read the end of the story. Something I'd written that I hadn't really seen. They read the end of the story as way different than I had thought of it. So I was really happy about that. That people were seeing something, I don't know, either more hopeful or less hopeful or whatever it might be. So yeah. I don't know, you bring to it what your own hopes for the world are.
Yeah. That seems very much of a piece with another subversion, I suppose, of horror tropes, that quite often in more conventional horror you have part of the narrative tension is that quite often the protagonist will be seeing something horrifying, everyone else around them will not acknowledge it. Whereas you're talking about The Lane and saying this is a common experience, or it is derived from an experience that many people have had. A really interesting thing with almost all of these stories is that there's often this completely consensual aspect of the horror, or the acknowledgement of nothingness. Everyone seems to be aware of it. And again, depending on the precise conditions present in the stories, it leads in different directions. At times, just extremely funny things happen. Like, people won't openly talk about whatever is causing them some sort of friction in their mundane lives, or this covering of nothing. And they'll organise, instead of just talking to each other, a council meeting to address this. Things like that, which I just thought were absolutely hilarious. This bureaucratic response, this way to escape having to actually talk to other people about it, instead doing it in this another, I suppose, stereotyped form, in the same way that people will fall back on everyday life, a series of rituals to cover over nothingness. They do the same thing in addressing it, have this ritualistic behaviour of the council meeting to, again, avoid openly confronting what's going on.
Yeah, and I think this thing of confronting, the thing I wanted to do there as well with that is this notion of confronting it as if it could be confronted, just because everyone is originally ignoring it. It's like the elephant in the room. They're finding ways to ignore it, and when they can't ignore it, often they just pass out or whatever it might be. And then when they finally do confront it via bureaucratic means, I think what I also wanted to say is that's not to say that there's going to be any resolution or anything there as well. So they've had to acknowledge it, and they're left with that like horrible feeling of, okay, we acknowledged the thing, and there isn't really enough resolution for them to actually go back to their nice lives. And I think, this is ultimately something I just saw growing up with people dealing with small town rumors, but then just ignoring them, or dealing with weird things happening and ignoring them because it's like I don't want to have to deal with that kind of worms, right? But at the same time, I always thought, well, you know about it now, and what is that little like brain worm doing to you? So yeah, yeah.
It is also, so for example, there's a man crying in the street. There is, at the very end of the book, this attempt to very concretely address, in some way, the problem. It just seems to be as shocking for the protagonist as the problem itself, or more so. So, like you said, there's not really a resolution. There's just a series of measures you can take, which themselves cause their own problems or have their own consequences.
Well, I think in the case of There's a Man Crying in the Street, it was actually close to being resolved, I think. That, spoiler alert, not spoiler alert, my own reading of it is that guy just needed a bit of love. And he never got it. And in my like headcanon of the actual what, because people, I'm actually happy to give the resolution, because it's not a resolution. At the end of this story, he's spoiler alert, he's this man who was crying in the street that everyone was uncomfortable with is quickly pushed into a van, and that's where I basically leave it. But in my mind, that he's just dropped off in another town, and that's where I really. But I didn't want to put that in. I wanted, So, but in my mind, there's still not resolution, because I don't. Even if he, I don't think these things are ever done. I don't think things are ever resolved. But there's also, I think one thing I would just add in there. There's one thing that I like to do with writing, especially with A Man Crying in the Street, is an explicit example of a behavior that we would consider basically infantile applied to an adult is a pretty horrible experience at the best of times. And I like to do that with language. There's a lot of words and language that people are reluctant to use, I think, because it is just absolutely babyish. So like yummy is a,
yummy
in my tummy.
Yeah.
And it's something sort of, I noticed it because a long time ago I was dating she was a preschool teacher, and I noticed how that actually she brought home that super babyish language that she had to use with the kids, like, oh, is your tum hurting? And instead of stomach, it was tummy, and I found it really an uncanny, horrible experience. So that in itself is, different forms of language that people are using is always intriguing, but that one especially is odd. Yeah.
So in terms of the process of writing these, so you said before that it was over this longer period, you having these ideas and then writing them, at least some of them, all in one sitting. Did you consciously try to vary some of the writing processes, or were they all written in more or less the same way? And was that intentional, to try to keep some sort of thematic or aesthetic similarity between these stories? Because they very much seem linked thematically and aesthetically. Or were you trying to change how you were writing to get different views on this nothingness problem?
So there's two stories in there. Dear me, I can't even remember the name of one of the stories, which is really bad. So the last story in the book, and
is that After All Things Maybe?
After All Things Maybe, yep. And then also
the long monologue,
and then also the story about the guy who just has the miserable life, and then
it doesn't narrow it down.
Oh yeah, it doesn't narrow it down, does it? To me, it's really bad that I can't remember that.
Is that some people?
Some people live in just their made for life.
That's the particularly miserable life.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah,
that's based on a real guy. I mean, that's like, if you knew the guy, you'd be like, you've just plagiarized this guy's life.
It's brutal.
Well, the ending, right? So all I'll say about that is the ending of that story is about a relationship to misery, which I am interested in because of this question of why do more people actually read a lot more miserable books? I don't know anyone who reads happy books, like explicitly happy books, even like crime thrillers. They're not happy books, and that's like the most popular genre. So that end question of like something a bit libidinal about that relationship, I won't spoil it too much. But those two stories, Some People Live and Just Ain't Made for Life, and the final story, they were just directly influenced by Thomas Bernhard, because I've been reading so much Thomas Bernhard that I wanted to do some sort of homage, in the sense that he has these, no paragraph breaks, rant monologues that go straight through. And the one at the end was really meant to be this, basically the idea was, what if someone was trying to retroactively or preemptively write their funeral speech, but their imagination was haywire and they just could not, really trying to control the text to such a degree that it just ends up basically a mess and a horrible. So those two had direct influence, and then the rest in terms of writing process. My actual writing process is still, I mean, with short stories it differs a bit because I just think, I just keep writing, and then the best thing to do with writing is just be honest. If it's not going to be long, you'll find out very soon, and then sometimes you go, oh dear, this actually needs to be a lot longer, and that would just be natural. But like in terms of how I write, though, I mean, one of the only sort of peculiar thing I do is put my headphones in and play. Even if I don't really want to listen to music, I'll play music really, really loud in my ears. But I just feel it like it forces something out that otherwise I sit and reason too much, and it's usually pretty. In all honesty, it's usually early 2000s trance music, which is like really fast paced. I find it just really helpful because basically it sort of detaches. I don't know. It's sort of apophatic. It detaches my sense. So then I'm just like, I'll just see what words fall out. And to be really, really pretentious, like I don't really think, we could say a writer is the writer. Sure, that makes sense. But I don't know. Are they my words? I didn't really choose most of these words. Yeah.
It is, yeah. It's interesting you say that because when I've written things, I find oftentimes the best writing occurs when I'm able to get out of my own way and to write the sort of things which I come back to the day after and feel some distance from. I don't quite feel like I was the one completely writing them. When you're able to use something, whether it is 90s trance music played really, really loud, or I tend to listen to death metal when I write, maybe for the same reasons. It's maybe ego destroying enough.
Yeah.
That I'm able to both not second guess what I'm writing enough, but also not overthink and just let something come out, let something follow its own internal logic, or to discover its internal logic or structure such that that can be pursued rather than what I guess, the author wants or what you want, which might be the wrong thing to follow.
Well, I've usually found, yeah, like you said, you get in your own way, and that's what I think. What honesty is not getting in your. Ironically, self-honesty is not getting in your own way. And sometimes you'll write a sentence that just seems insane, and but that's what I had to be. And sometimes story ideas, there is something that happens when your guard is let down. I mean, to give a peculiar instance, I remember getting really, really odd ideas in my mind, like just peculiar imaginative ideas when I was passing a kidney stone. And I think it was because every single faculty in my body was focusing on something else. And it was like, we have to like drop all unconscious barriers for like however many hours, like 5 hours. We have to drop all these barriers. And then it's like, well, look, we can't help these ideas coming through right now. Like, we can't give you the energy needed to withhold. And yeah, it's just, I can't really remember much of them now, but I remember at the time just thinking, like, this is like a weird delirium. And I think if you can tap into that in the writing process, even to some degree of, like with the music, right, it's something that just ironically blocks off ideas, because if you try force an idea, it's like, it's within a prior structure of reason that it's just going to seem really, really repetitive. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's what's happening with the music, right? Yeah.
Probably more easily replicable than passing kidney stones. Do you have opiates on board to help you along, or was it just the pain of one of your ureters being
I didn't have anything
stretched out by calculus?
Oh, you like that one again? You're back.
I'm back.
No, I didn't have anything. I didn't have anything at the time. It was just pain.
Just pain.
Just pure pain.
It's were there or are there any stories that particularly surprised you in the process of writing, with you getting out of your own way and something being produced that you really didn't expect, or which still in hindsight doesn't seem like something that you would make normally?
I mean, the most pleasant ending for the story is the place is green like sea foam, and as you described it. I did not plan the rekindling of their marriage at all, but by the end, I realized I really liked them as a couple, and they were just trying to get something done. I think that was the point with that whole. Like, I had to have this absolutely absurd idea to sort of make you basically realize, take you away from what's actually going on. And really, it was just I'm so intrigued by people in history and people I've known who are more than just happy to just go right in just horrible, absurd situations. The kind of people who go like, we just need to get this done. That's a mentality that really interests me, and the ability to do that. And so all of a sudden, this wife, sort of, waking up and being like, I know, okay, we actually we've got some sort of weird duty. That I didn't plan that at all. The marriage aspect of that I didn't plan. It was going to be more about the other thing that's going on, but I eventually realized that's just not it. Like, what intrigued me about that story was basically I realized, hang on, this absolutely absurd, horrible thing doesn't actually matter at all. It actually doesn't matter. By the end of the story, you don't really care about that. Well, I didn't so much.
I did really enjoy it because I don't want to give away too much of the story because the situation is just so ridiculous. Being surprised by it is really worthwhile, but I was surprised because I expected that their marriage will be placed under strain by this completely ridiculous demand made upon initially the husband by a completely ridiculous person, and that the wife woke up and said, well, we've got to deal with it. I didn't expect that, and then I didn't expect how absolutely matter of fact carrying out this completely ridiculous project would be.
Yeah,
but it was really surprising in a very effective way.
I mean, not trying not to spoil it, but the point. I mean, I'm trying not to inflate my own sense of, I don't think it's Ulysses or something like that, but the sense that it surprised me was when I realized what exactly they were doing as a couple when they were, kind of spoiler alert, but spreading something onto a tarp. Like what that was. I was like, hang on a minute. But I like, the banality amidst horror is existence. I mean, I think at the moment I'm getting more and more into Darwin and Darwinian appreciations of things, and this sort of, I think it's maybe sometimes a bit too deconstructive, but the fact that life is ultimately existing in a cycle of what we project to be horrendous death, destruction, decay, which I think is a complete projection. And I think the ability to sit amidst that and not, maybe you don't have to find beauty in it, but just to sit next to it and be fine with it really is what has been my own experience within the modern world for a long time of basically a grey swamp peppered with moments of harrowing weirdness. And then you just sort of shake it off and move on, and be surprised that everyone is, perfectly fine with what just happened, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Something very striking about that story is that I think uniquely among all of the responses in this collection to nothingness or to some sort of extreme situation is that this married couple approached it with a very matter-of-fact, everyday heroism of just saying, well, we have a problem and we're going to address it.
I mean, they addressed. I mean, there's something in that, right? That I think is probably a bit too, maybe retrospectively, is a bit too obvious that they deal with a problem, and actually, what comes from that is a blossoming of a rekindling of their marriage, and they are. Hang on, I'm trying to think. They are really the only people who deal with their problem properly. So there is one other guy who is trying to deal with his problem, but he's doing so with the structures he's given, which is Bonefoot don't have hair. Where the guy, so this story is about a guy who's quite literally just falling apart, like in physically falling apart, and because he is attending to his problem via bureaucratic means, well, you'll see what happens. But I think if he'd have dealt with his problem, if he'd been honest with himself and been like, right, you know what, I'm actually storming down to the doctors right now, instead of, he probably would have been fine. And I think this is what, I mean, maybe that story with the Seafoam story, those two are the only ones who actually see the problem for what it is, and they accept, like, they don't really question the reality of it. Neither of them question the reality of what is insane. They're like, all right then.
The matter of factness was it's I guess it contributes both to the horror and again to that paired comedy that they're so incredibly accepting of it. it takes the wife, it seems, overnight to just accept that this is what they have to deal with. The you should have come in earlier ending to Bone Feet Don't Have Hair as well was basically summed up the healthcare experience.
I mean, it's a pretty obvious story. It's a pretty obvious metaphor, right? But it was good fun. I think, in this matter of factness, I mean, one of the influences I think that I probably didn't realize for this book is a writer called Daniel Kalms, who's sort of he's an absurdist writer. It's spelled DaniilKharms, if anyone wants to look him up. But something I'd like to do when I hopefully write more short stories is actually Daniel Kalms has a very intriguing metatextual relationship with his text, which is even more matter of fact in the sense that he finishes some stories by saying, I can't be bothered to write anymore. I can't be bothered to finish the story. And there's one where he can't be bothered to finish it. You can tell he can't be bothered to finish it. So the character just throws themselves out the window for no reason. And you can only do that stuff so much before it would become tiresome. But there is something I want to do more with that of an honesty about one's, one gets attached to their character. I mean, I'm either really needlessly cruel to my characters, or reluctantly loving, usually very cruel. But yeah, so I mean, but there's something I want to do there with just playing with characters more, and for even if they're on a natural path somewhere, forcing them again to, I don't know, ruining their day or whatever it might be.
Obviously throwing roadblocks in their path. There were definitely a few moments, like Thoughts and Memories of Violet.
Yeah, I was pretty cruel to that guy. I was talking to someone about that last night, actually. They mentioned that, and they said, "No, you really went for this guy." That story was meant to be actually a story about the ridiculousness of horror tropes, because he deals with them all in a way. But what happens when the horror narrative? Because one element of that story, which I won't spoil, which I often watch. So this was pointed out many, many years ago, and it sort of began, I guess, for me, a postmodern analysis when I was really young of TV. There was not a sitcom, a soap opera. I hated soap operas when I was young, but I ended up watching tons of them because we only had one TV, and it was what my parents watched. It's sort of very absurd thing in its own right. Mm-hmm. And there's something very odd about soap operas. Once again, a whole story compressed, and just to give example of some of the British soap operas, there was one, it's ended now, called Heartbeat, which was set in Yorkshire in the 60s, but the show ran for 60 years. So they never left the 60s in my mind. I was like, hang on, this is insane. But another thing that was pointed out, there was a soap opera called Hollyoaks. Neighbours, which I think is Australian.
Neighbours.
Yeah. But someone pointed out years and years ago that no one in Neighbours had ever had a wee, never gone to the loo. And I remember thinking, this is horrible to think about. This is something potently weird about that. And the idea of, I mean, look, there is a pragmatic reason for this in TV shows, because it would be odd to have really what we would consider postmodern banalities inserted into media, like, hang on a minute, I just got to have a pee, and then someone stood around for 2 minutes while someone goes to the loo. It would be weird. But the notion of interjecting them into the oh-so-serious horror narrative ruins it, right? What happens if when the werewolf is running after you, you really need a wee? I mean, it just ruins the whole... it ruins everything. So throwing those small things in is good fun.
Yeah, checking his phone and things like that rather than
dealing with his problems. Yeah.
When that was also an interesting one, because that was one of the places where nothingness really finds this very concrete expression. Again, not wanting to spoil some of the really unexpected twists and turns of that particular plot, but that was one of the stories where nothingness is presented or manifests itself in quite a unique way as compared to some of the other stories. And again, what was very funny is this man's response to it is to pull out his phone and start scrolling or to eat a chocolate bar.
Yeah.
Go
I
to
mean,
the toilet.
so that was one as well that was going to be a lot longer because there's a point. So there's a point in this story where basically reality starts to fall apart, and he ends up cycling through horror tropes, basically. And it was going to be a lot longer in the sense I was going to spend a lot more time in those places, but I soon realized like this guy doesn't like. That was where the character's talking to you because I realized it doesn't matter how long I spend there. This guy doesn't give a like, doesn't care. So it doesn't matter, you know. So I didn't want to drag it on too much longer because it didn't matter where I put this guy. His mind is elsewhere. He's not dealing with anything. Yeah, and then there's the end of the story, which you'll see if you read the book.
Yeah. So in terms of writing these stories, at least as first drafts, it seems that at least to a large extent you were, by using 90s trance music, trying to get out of your own way. But during the editing process, during that, to what extent were you trying to guide the stories in a certain direction? To what extent were you looking at their natural inner trajectory and just trying to work with that? How conscious versus unconscious, if you'll allow me to be very pretentious, was the editing process?
That was conscious in the sense of because of this focus on nothingness. One thing I'll do, which people will probably say you're just copying Cormac McCarthy, which I don't use speech marks because I'm in agreement with McCarthy on that. I don't think anywhere close to as good as him, obviously, but I'm in agreement with his reasoning, which just clutters up the page. And it teaches you as a writer to be able to write dialogue in a sense that's more natural because you have to do so in a way that the reader would intuitively understand that it's moved on. But it also, I think, that for me, this whole like, here is this blocked off bit of text, which in a semantic sense you're saying because of these icons is speech. It ruins nothingness for me on a textual level. So one thing I constantly trying to do is be more blunt, be more minimal because of the nothingness thing. If I wasn't focusing on nothingness so much, I would have, maybe changed the editing process. But a lot of things like, having a fair amount of line breaks and not paragraphing things up as much to allow things to just be like, when you look at the book, a lot of the speech, a lot of the text seems like it's just completely on its own. And things like that. I mean, I will say in terms of the book, retrospectively, there is one clear time when I don't think I'm honest with myself about what I should have done, and that's the ending to the cruise, which two people have said to me, why did you do that? And my answer, I won't spoil the ending to the cruise, but if you read the book and you read the story of the cruise, my answer to why I did that is because I didn't want to let them win. I didn't want to let the people... I couldn't bear...
It felt very malicious.
Oh, it was. I couldn't bear them. I could not bear them insufferable. There was and now actually, talking about editing, so there's a point in the cruise, so the cruise is around two people go on, a couple win a trip to go on an infamous cruise, which is meant to be the best cruise in the world. They end up on this cruise ship where there's nothing to do. That was the premise. But at the start, I very quickly described their life. And I basically end by saying it is as vapid and empty and insufferable as you think it is. And I did have a sentence there which was going to say, and I, the author, hate their fucking guts. But I took it out. Because I thought, no, I'm going too far. There was a bit of that throughout the text. Sorry if I'm not allowed to swear. But then by the end, I think...
no problem.
Okay. But then by the end, I think that my thoughts for these people came back in with what I consider, to be honest, probably a failed ending. Because it is just like, you know what? I can't be dealing with them. I want them gone. So, yeah.
There was definitely a feeling I had throughout that particular story of... the author here just fucking hates these characters. He does not like them at all.
They had so many chances, man. They had so many chances, I think, to... All I wanted them to do as a couple was to sincerely talk to one another. I have one moment of honesty and organic. Like, when you create characters, I don't really think it's if you develop characters in such a way in your mind, you can't just consciously change who they are. And maybe that's a frustration, right? And so the frustration is I couldn't find a natural moment of them having that moment of being sincere with each other. And so by the end, you think, these are awful. These are awful people.
There is something very, very intimate about developing a character to the point where their inner structure does stop you as the author from changing what they do too much. Otherwise, it starts to be untrue, according to their composition. But that also does make characters you dislike uniquely infuriating, and that did really come across in that story of you, the author, having to deal with these two that you must know very intimately because they're functioning within your mind, but just they're fundamentally unable to behave in a way that you like.
Yeah, and I mean that's what a good character should do. I think is that's what a good character should do. I mean, I don't personally think you really have full. If you have conscious control over everyone's actions, it doesn't really make any sense. There's things characters would and would not do. Yeah.
So in the editing process, was it mostly refining the trajectory of these characters? Were there? So you mentioned actually what you call the failed ending of this book, where you just threw a roadblock in the way of these two characters.
Yeah. Well, I threw a roadblock, but I think because I put it there at the start. And it was for me a thing again that I didn't want to forget, and that was one point I was trying to make, but I don't think I made it right. So, yeah. But having maybe the courage to accept an ending when it's an ending, however, I mean, it's tough as a writer to be writing no resolutions, really. In my own mind, I could say, I've got my own resolutions or whatever. But so that's the thing, is to be able to say this is done, but the story is still completely open, which is what good horror is something left undone.
Were there other moments with other stories where you as the writer intervened and shook up the snow globe, so to speak, rather than let things carry themselves out in a way that they would naturally without your explicit intervention?
No, I don't think. No, the rest. I think the rest I allowed to do what they needed to do. Yeah, and that ultimately, I mean, there was some stories where pages and pages were cut because, and it's sort of like a brutal. You've put this energy, but what you cut, you usually eventually realize it's your own conscious work, and you're like, I'm trying to interject on whatever is coming through. So yeah. And there was about, as I say, there was about 4 stories that didn't make it just because they were maybe becoming too conscious, and they had a ridiculousness that I probably couldn't control by the end. Yeah, I think that was
There are events, and then probably a more conscious commentary, and you want to reduce the conscious commentary to a large extent. In terms of your process of writing, for people listening who are trying to write things themselves, are you writing every day, or for There's a Man Crying in the Street, were you writing daily? Were there set times for you to write? Or did you accumulate these ideas and then just try to smash them out when you felt they were ready?
So it was written about over a fairly long time. I mean, 2 cover stories were written maybe 2 years ago, and then the rest were over the course of a year. And honestly, I'm most productive, unfortunately, between 11 p.m. and about 3 a.m., which is the weird zone. And it's usually when you just, you write a few lines and then away you go. With this project in particular, I didn't have a set. With book length projects of a whole novel or non-fiction works, I do have set amounts of, what I usually do with it's really different from my normal writing process, because when I've written book length things which aren't short stories or aren't snippets, I section it out into 1,000-word sections, and then I'm like, right, I've got to write one of them a week or whatever it might be, which makes the whole process a lot easier. But with short stories, you can't really do that because, the majority of them, other than a couple, were written in 1 or 2 sittings, just from see where it goes.
And are there any similarities or influences from your other projects on this project? So were there things that you, for example, read or interacted with for the Hermitix podcast or for your previous books that found their way into this collection of stories? Or is this to be taken quite separately from everything else you've done?
No, it's not to be taken separately. I think there's a ton of influence. You never really can. You don't see your influences often until it's done. But I mean, as I said, Blanchot is an influence, Thomas Bernhard, but then also weird fiction writers, Arthur Machen, Thomas Ligotti. I'm trying to think. I mean, yeah. Those are the main ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in terms of publishing this book, was it written from the beginning to be self-published as your previous books?
So I had written these stories, put it all in, and had it ready. So there was a publisher interested, but it was good because of how publishing works. It was going to be a long time, fairly long time, not for publishing it, but it would have been about 1.5 years until they'd have gone through what they already need to publish this as a short story collection. So we agreed that I'm going to write something else for them. And my reason for that wasn't being greedy or impatient. I honestly wasn't. It was because I basically thought, and I know this, writing happens in a certain atmosphere, in a certain time frame. If you don't get it done in a certain time frame where the atmosphere is right for it, it's never going to get done again. You won't be able to do it. And the same thing with the idea of this document sitting on my computer, which is meant for this time, as far as I'm concerned. Then, I've had enough trouble talking about books 6 months post because you just think, I don't remember writing that. I don't want, so I didn't want it sitting around, basically. It just didn't feel, I don't like that. Because you go back and you then 2 years down the line, I'd be trying to having to go back and it just doesn't. So I like things to be done and threshed out.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask because the dynamics of conventional publishing versus self-publishing are such now that you have a lot of very, very high quality books coming out that are self-published, as is the case with this particular collection of short stories. And it's interesting to hear why people choose one particular method of publishing over another, rather than it just being forced upon them. It's, well, this is not good enough, so a conventional publisher won't touch it. When people have that optionality, it's really interesting hearing why they've picked one thing.
So, in terms of, there is an absolute ton of incredible literature that not only is being self-published, but is coming out from presses that you could say are really utilizing the print on demand by Amazon or what's the other one, Lightsource, right? Really small publishers that would never, in the old traditional sense, be able to fund their ventures if it wasn't for this ability. And there is a ton of incredible writing happening that way. As for why I pick self-publishing, firstly, when you first start out, chances of you getting a publisher are slim. You're going to be I don't like waiting around. And you're going to be waiting around a long, long time. You're also going to have to probably change what you want to write. And it's going to go back and forth. It's going to be very frustrating. And over a period of 2 years, once your thing is done, you're then going to have all this proofreading and editing, and you're just going to hate. You're gonna hate the book more than you already do. But you're also just gonna end up sort of resenting it. And by the time it's done, you can talk to most writers, and they just think they have to do these interviews and things, and they usually one of the first thing they says is, been out a long, it's been out of their brain a long time. Also, I think honestly for most writers, if you have a moderate online audience, and I'm not even talking over 10,000 followers or whatever it might be, you probably are going to make more money from self-publishing. Full transparency, I make 50 to 150 pounds a month from my books, sometimes 200. That's what I make a month. It doesn't sound a lot, but it's probably as much as you'd make with like if you're an average author, that's what you're going to make. Like there, it's distribution laws again. There's only 1% of people who are making the big bucks from writing or whatever. So, that's all I'm making from writing. But yeah, I think, the reasons for me are just more pragmatic. Just get it out, get it done. Once you have that like exorcism of ideas, and you get it out there, it is very cathartic. And I don't think you really care. Obviously, it probably sound like cope. You really don't care about people reading it as much once it's done, right? It's the process of being able to say, I've got this big lump of clay in my head, and once you've carved it up and done all that, and it's there, that's like 95% of it. And beyond that, if you're honest about how much you're going to make, I mean, I don't think people are writing for money. Maybe you could say you write for status. I really think most people are creating art, and the best reason to create art is because you don't see what you want to see out there, right? And so once you've taken this lump of clay and done all the stuff, and you have this thing that you think, man, that's as good as I can do, the rest doesn't really matter so much. That's not to say I'm not going to look at reviews. I do look at reviews. I'm only human. I've known writers who say they explicitly don't look at reviews, and then a year later they've said, yeah, I went and looked at all my reviews, because that's what you do.
It's very hard not to look at them. There was one review of this collection which I think said something along the lines of, "Thank God I'm not British."
Yep.
Which
yeah,
I definitely got the feeling of when I was writing this as well. Yeah. It's a very particular type of overcast, drizzly Britishness that's in the background of all of these stories.
Yeah, I'm proud of that review. I'm very proud of that review.
So, are there any other projects you'd like people to know about who are listening before we wrap this up?
Well,
any more books that are coming up?
Books?
Or you just don't want to think about writing anything for the moment?
No. I don't want to think about writing, but it's because I have to. I'm actually working on. Well, right. So at the moment, mostly I want people to go buy this book, but in September I have a book coming out, A Spiritual Introduction to Christianity, with Aeon Press, which is a spiritual introduction to Christianity. I'm also working on another book for them with Aaron French, which is on esoteric Christianity, a guide to esoteric Christianity. And then I'm also working on a novel. But I also don't really want to be writing.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah, I don't like. This is the thing, man. I think I honestly wish I didn't have the compulsion to write, because there's almost no positives to it. It's something you do. It's something you do, and as Cormac McCarthy said in a very, very early interview, you'd have to be insane to write a book, because why would you do it? And the only reason I can come up with is because the thing that's in your mind, whatever that might be, you have to see it in reality. You have to form it, and it's that breath of like, oh, finally, I'm somewhat rid of whatever the hell that was. I think that's the reason, because no one's writing for money. No one's writing for enjoyment, because it's just painful and annoying and frustrating, and
boring. Much of the time.
Yeah, boring.
Most importantly, it's actually often very boring.
Well, a good chunk of what you have to write is, for instance, you might very well be writing a very fun story about, check out Woman Being Dead, and there's a few scenes you're really excited to get to that point. But you also have to, think, I've got to get him from the car to the store, right? And it's, oh my God, it's so, but it is boring at times to do that. And, I think this is where I'd actually recommend Stephen King's, but I'm not a huge fan of Stephen King, but he had a book on writing where he says, like, look, if you need a character to go into the lounge, to walk from the dining room to the lounge, you don't need to write she whimsily, I don't know, skipped across the beige carpet, blah blah blah. You just right. She walked from the dining room to the lounge, and that really helped me as a writer to be like, yeah, come on, like. And then you can go back and you can look at what needs to be done, but you might be thinking, oh my god, you get burnt out on thinking about, okay, he's in the car, he needs to get out of the car, cross the car park, through the doors. Just right, he walked from, and the man walked to the. For me, it's sort of just be minimal. Like, I love minimalism. There's no why you don't need to drum this up. Yeah.
It is very funny where you're talking about that compulsion of wishing to write things is almost a mental illness. As an aberrant behavior, because I've only published one book, but that's very much reminiscent of my experiences with writing. It's actually not particularly enjoyable much of the time. It's more a relief when this particular story, collection of characters, collection of situations is not your problem anymore. You've put it out into the world now. You can, apart from podcast appearances like this one, you can largely forget about it and ignore it.
Yeah.
In terms of that, so overcoming the boredom and frustration, for you, is it just that compulsion of having this thing in your head that won't leave you alone, that you want to, you said earlier, exercise? Or is there anything else that makes you write? Because you've got writing, was it 2 works with other people plus a novel it's a large amount to write. There's a lot of projects to have it going at once.
But I don't understand what relaxation is. I think that's a problem. I like to keep busy. I like to be working on things. I know. On an almost like a personal note, and lots of people will say this. The times when I'm most down and most, I don't know, you could say anxious or whatever, is just when I'm not busy. I like to keep busy. Some people don't. I do. So. And whoever said life's meant to be enjoyable, that's it's a projection, I think. It's something we've just come up with, this idea that it's meant to be enjoyable. So, but there's moments when you certainly enjoy it, when an idea starts spooling out, but they're rare. I stick with what I said. It's mostly just an exorcism of something you want to see in the world that isn't in the world. Yeah.
The busyness is your response to the nothingness.
Yeah, sure. Keep busy.
Keep it in the context of.
Well, keeping busy. Keeping busy stops you from asking silly questions, doesn't it? Just it's good to keep busy. I've got stuff to do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on. I've been a big fan of Hermitix for a while. Really enjoyed this book. Looking forward to a novel for you.
Yeah.
Come out with that one. Not sure how far off that'll be. Those things tend to take
probably about 2 years by the time it's published. Which is nothing, I say that. I say speedy. That, and yeah, it really is. Yeah.
It's incredible when you hear about people writing novels. I think Faulkner wrote some of his in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Smash them out. I think it was As I Lay Dying.
So I know that
in a few weeks when he was working as a coal miner.
God, who was it? Anthony Burgess wrote Clockwork Orange, I think in a week or 2 weeks, because they said
it's not fair.
Cormac McCarthy wrote The Road in it was about a month, I think. Yeah.
That is an astonishing speed of work.
Yeah, I think.
I suppose there are
McCarthy and Faulkner, especially. Some books I'd say, yeah, fair enough, that was written in 3 weeks. But those two, that's when you realise people are geniuses.
Yeah, I suppose it is. There's the intersection of speed plus quality, which makes those two exceptional. I'm sure I could write plenty of things in a week, but
I don't know. I don't know if I could. I don't think I could. I don't know if I could, because I get caught up in the details. I just think I can't even process it.
Okay, thank you very, very much for coming on.
Yeah, it's been great.
Book was There's a Man Crying in the Street. Really encourage anyone listening who's listened this far to go out and get a copy. It's very much worth reading. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. It's been great.